A captivating choice. This subtitle, The Siren Song of Sacramento, perfectly encapsulates the transition from the hardship of the journey to the moment of arrival, where the promise of immense wealth is at its loudest, just before reality sets in. This 3,500-word section will focus on the final leg of the journey, crossing the Sierras, the intoxicating sight of the gold capital, the feverish atmosphere of Sacramento in 1849, and the first devastating realization that the dreams sold back east are lies. The Siren Song of Sacramento. The Sierra Nevada. To the men of the wagon train, crawling across the last dusty miles of the Great Basin, the mountains were not a geographical feature. They were the final, shimmering curtain separating them from destiny. For months, the only horizon they knew was flat, pale, and endless. Now the Sierras rose like a violent, upthrusted fortress, snow-capped, indigo, and intimidating, but offering too the first promise of water and shade they had seen in weeks. Silas Thorne and Elias Kincaid, the reluctant leaders, rode side by side at the head of the depleted company. The internal distrust had curdled, not entirely healed, but contained by the monumental task ahead. Jedediah Shaw, the trader who had almost been abandoned, was now a silent, spectral passenger on Kincaid's newly lightened wagon, a constant living reminder of the consequences of greed. The final ascent was a brutal, slow-motion violence against the land. Axles groaned, oxen slipped on loose scree, and the air thinned to a sharp, cold sting after the desert heat. They abandoned everything they could, more tools, spare planks, heavy, unnecessary books, every pound tossed overboard to save energy for the human engine. It was an involuntary shedding of the past, stripping themselves down to the core necessity of survival. Then, one sun-drenched afternoon, they reached the summit of the pass. The world opened up beneath them. It was a dizzying vista of pines and granite, giving way to rolling hills of emerald green, a sudden, shocking explosion of color after the khaki and brown monotony of the plains. Far, far in the distance, a hazy, pale band shimmered. It was the valley of the Sacramento River, and somewhere within that haze lay the town, the gateway, the heart of the great promise. California, Elias Kincaid breathed, his voice thick with emotion, sounding a reverence he hadn't shown since they left the familiar world. His eyes, usually anxious, were wide with a fierce, burning hope, like a man seeing the face of his fortune. Silas merely nodded, but his iron grip on the reins slackened. For the first time in nearly a year, the crippling fear that he had risked his family's future on a pamphlet and a rumor began to dissipate. The land looked rich. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, not dust and desperation. The siren song was clear. You made it. You survived. Now take your reward. The descent was easier, but no less dangerous, and the shift in climate brought a new threat: rain. The dry, cracked earth of the foothills, so welcoming at first sight, quickly turned to thick, clinging mud. Their trail became a sluice, forcing the wagons to skid and slide. When the company finally emerged from the mountains and stumbled into the valley floor, the journey was effectively over, replaced by a new urgency: the race. The path through the valley was already choked. They were not alone. Wagon trains that had taken different cuts, travelers who had arrived by ship in San Francisco and worked their way inland, a chaotic, polyglot stream of humanity flowed toward the confluence of the American and Sacramento rivers. Men on horseback, their faces stubbled and hard, hurried past the slow, lumbering wagons. Here the true fever began. It was a tangible, infectious excitement that contrasted sharply with the weary cynicism of the trail. Men spoke in rapid, clipped sentences, their eyes darting, their hands gesticulating in estimations of ounces and dollars. "They're pulling out 40 ounces a day up at Hangtown," shouted a grizzled, retreating man who looked half mad with exhaustion and excitement. "Gold is everywhere! Just scratch the surface!" Another yelled, spurring the horse onward, his sack jingling with what sounded like real weight. These reports, unverifiable, often wildly exaggerated, were the siren song's chorus, washing away the memory of cholera, thirst, and betrayal. Even the hardened members of Silas's company began to forget the sacrifices they had made and focus only on the wealth they were about to claim. Elias, despite the practical lessons of the trail, was giddy. "Silas, do you hear them? A goose egg of gold! I knew it! I told Eleanor, this is the making of our family name!" Silas, however, felt a prickle of unease. He watched the faces, not of the men rushing in, but of the few who were rushing out. Those men were not joyful. They were empty, their eyes holding a deep, terrifying hollowness. The town of Sacramento City was not a city at all. It was a sprawl of absolute chaotic impermanency, built at the very edge of the wild. They arrived at the great Embarcadero, the landing on the Sacramento River, just as the late autumn rains began to turn the valley floor into a quagmire. The moment they pulled their wagons into the city, the last vestiges of the old world evaporated. Sacramento was a mud hole of desperate commerce. The streets were not streets. They were trenches of thick, impassable brown sludge, churned by thousands of boots, hooves, and wagon wheels. Tents, not houses, lined the riverbank. Canvas shelters, lean-tos, rough shacks thrown up from green lumber that warped in the damp air. But amidst the filth and the order was money. The sound was not the clink of gold pans, but the aggressive hammer of commerce. Merchants shouted prices that bordered on robbery. A single egg, $1. A tin of preserved oysters, $15. A pair of boots guaranteed to last a month in the muck, $50. Silas Thorne, the man who had commanded a disciplined company, suddenly felt small and profoundly vulnerable. He was not a miner yet, he was a buyer, and he was being fleeced by men who had arrived months before him. He was approached immediately by a man named Higgins, a slick-haired vendor in a surprisingly clean suit, who offered to buy his remaining wagon stock. "Captain," he purred, rubbing his hands as he eyed the wagon's inventory, a few sacks of flour, some iron tools, a half-barrel of whiskey. "I'll give you a good price, a fair price, $50 for the lot." "$50?" Silas scoffed. "The flour alone cost me that back in St. Louis." "Ah, but that was St. Louis, Captain. This is the new world. $50, or you can drag it through the muck to the diggings and pray a coyote doesn't chew through your canvas." He leaned closer. "The value here isn't in what you brought. It's in what you can buy now. And what you need now, Captain, is to get to the river." Silas felt the humiliation burn in his throat. He was a fool. All the planning, all the hardship, only to arrive here and be subject to the whims of the price gougers. He sold the flour for $30 and held on to the tools, the transaction leaving a foul, coppery taste in his mouth. Elias, meanwhile, was experiencing a different kind of shock. He was standing near the riverbank, where hundreds of abandoned clippers and merchant ships lay rotting, their crews having immediately deserted for the gold fields. He watched a miner, a man whose clothes were patched and whose beard was matted, try to pay for a shot of whiskey with a single, coarse lump of gold. The barkeep, a massive man with forearms like cured hams, bit the metal, spat, and shook his head. "Tarnished, full of copper. Get out of here, 49er. Bring me dust, or bring me dollars." The miner was thrown out into the mud. Elias stared at the gold lump on the ground. Worthless. He had assumed gold was gold. He looked around. The siren song wasn't really about riches. It was about the belief in riches. The economy was built entirely on speculation and the desperation of the newcomers.
Maeve Odell, the washerwoman, had been observing the same scene. She was already setting up a small washing station near a clean patch of the river. Her son, Tommy, was carefully stacking firewood. "Mrs. Odell," Elias said, approaching her, "you are not heading to the diggings." Maeve wrung a dirty shirt and hung it on a rope she had strung between two pines. "Mr. Kincaid," she replied, her gaze steady, "I have no pick, no rifle, and no tolerance for fever. My gold is here." She gestured to the pile of soiled, sweat-soaked mining clothes. "A miner pays me $1 a shirt to wash the mud and the dust off. They are so eager to get back to the river, they won't stop for laundry." Elias was dumbfounded. She was not hunting for fortune, she was selling necessity. She had found her own small river of gold by servicing the failure of others. "And your son?" Elias asked. "Tommy brings in $1 a day gathering kindling," she said without looking up. "The men burn it all up trying to boil water. We will be rich, Mr. Kincaid, not by digging, but by being the last folks to stop working." That night, Silas stood guard over the camp he had set up in a sparse, wooded area just outside the worst of the mud. He saw the firelight glinting off the water of the American River nearby. The siren song was still playing, but now it sounded different, less like a promise and more like a taunt. The final, devastating revelation came from Jedediah, the broken man. Elias had managed to get him water and some rough food. Jedediah was still weak, but his fever had broken, leaving him clear-eyed and defeated. "Silas," Jedediah whispered, his voice catching in the damp, cold air. "The mountains were a lie. I saw it, back at the pass, just before you found me." Silas knelt beside him. "What did you see, Jedediah?" The gold, it's not lying there. I saw men, Silas, hundreds of them. They are working that river like dogs. They don't pan. They move tons of earth. The easy gold, it's gone. Picked up by the ones who got here first. We were too late." Jedediah's words were not a rumor or a boast. They were the cold, hard conclusion of a man who had lost everything for a lie. The truth descended upon Silas with the weight of the Sierra Nevadas. The thousands of people who had rushed in 1849, the famous 49ers, were already too late for the easy fortune. The gold rush had matured in the time it took them to cross the continent. The simple panning was over. Now it was about labor, organization, capital, and luck. It was about moving tons of dirt just to find a speck. He looked out at the lights of Sacramento, flickering through the wet trees. The initial intoxicating hope of the Golden State had been replaced by the stark, brutal challenge of the mining frontier. He had brought his people to the promised land, but the promise was conditional, built on the back-breaking labor that lay ahead. He got up, his limbs stiff, and walked to his own wagon. He pulled out his iron shovel and his heavy pickaxe. They were no longer the tools of a quick fortune. They were the implements of a desperate war against the earth. He felt the presence of Elias behind him, holding a cheap lantern. "He's right, isn't he, Captain?" Elias's voice was low, hollow. "We sold our farms. We risked our lives to get here, just in time for the scraps." Silas hefted the shovel, feeling the familiar rough wood of the handle. "We are here, Elias," he said, the old command returning to his voice. "And we are alive. We are not turning back to a ruined life back east, and we are not giving our tools to Higgins for $50. The gold is here. It is simply buried deeper than the newspapers promised." He looked out at the lights of the city again, the source of the siren song. It was a beautiful lie, but now they knew the truth. "Tomorrow, Elias," Silas announced, his voice carrying the finality of a decision that could not be reversed. "We leave this cursed, beautiful city. We head upriver, and we will go to war with that riverbed." The siren song had lured them to the shore. Now the river itself would demand their blood, sweat, and toil.